It kind of looks like a little bit of an improvement, but for all the bragging about the numbers of billions or hundreds of billions that have been identified as Doge, I kind of expected more than a drop in non-discretionary budget, 163 billion, but then 113 billion more for defense for a net maybe reduction of 50 billion. Was I expecting too much?
Well, Lars, no, I don't think so. We have to step back and think about the Constitution and what system did the founders set up. And it really requires not just the president to offer a budget, but Congress has to act and legislate and make savings permanent. And it's the responsibility of every citizen and we the people to demand a lot more than what we've seen out of Washington. So it's a decent first step. But again, the president's budget is an opening bid, and the real work is done by Congress to lock in budget savings. And as DOGE has, found $160 billion in waste. I think there's a whole lot more to find. Back in the 1980s, President Reagan's Grace Commission found that 1 out of every 3 tax dollars is wasted. So, Lars, if you extrapolate that to today's numbers, that's more than $2 trillion.
Yep.
So I think they need to go back to the $2 trillion number, and I think people of good faith, of common sense, all over the country, a lot of your listeners, if you put them in charge, they would figure out how to get the $2 trillion. And it's really up to all of us to demand that level of savings from not just the president and the administration, but really from Congress. And they need to work together and step up. We've been growing the federal government for 100 years. We now have 441 agencies. I'd like to see that number reduced by about 437 so that we go back to the original 4 that the founders wanted, which is defense, state, treasury, and justice. And, just to compromise, maybe you could throw in Department of Interstate Commerce to catch everything else. But
okay,
but really, that's not extreme at all. That's what our founders set up. And I think normal, regular people, I don't care what party you're in, they know that Washington is way, way too big and that we need to scale back what the federal government's doing.
And believe me, John, I remind my audience all the time. They'll say, well, Reagan spent this and Clinton spent that. And I say, no, presidents don't spend. They don't have any authority to spend a single dime. That's the Congress. And I think one of the big disappointments in Trump's first term was that very first budget where he thought, okay, you've got a Republican House, a Republican Senate, you got a Republican president, Donald Trump. What are we going to see? And what the Republicans produced in the Congress was, if I remember right, a gigantic increase in government spending under Republicans. And you think, how is that possible? These are the folks who always talk about cutting the size of government, and they're growing it instead.
That's right. Yeah, nothing unites both parties quite like the joy of spending other people's money. And spending has been a bipartisan problem for years. And, back in the Tea Party era when I worked for Senator Coburn, we actually did cut spending for the first time since the end of the Korean War on a year-to-year basis. That was about $50 billion. We got rid of earmarks. It saved $140 billion. And we actually forced the Government Accountability Office, to identify duplication. And according to their claims, that saved about $600 billion over 10 years or so. So it is possible. There's a lot more, and I think DOGE can go a lot farther than we did in the Tea Party era. But again, it's not. There's so much good faith and bad faith critique of DOGE. The good faith critique is, they do need to find more. Just what we just talked about. They need to be more ambitious, not less ambitious. But the idea that DOGE hasn't found cuts, well, it's not really DOGE's job to make cuts. It's their job to identify savings. But as you said, it's the job of Congress to really make the cuts permanent. And that's what the American people overwhelmingly support. And polls show that time after time. Is they want to see better efficiency. They understand that if you downsize federal agencies, you actually upsize the agency of every individual American, because every dollar saved in Washington is a dream realized in someone's life and American families.
John Hart is CEO of OpenTheBooks.com, and I highly recommend you go there and take a look at the numbers they developed, because you can do a deep, deep dive into all that. But, for example, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, says that we're wasting somewhere between $250 billion and $500 billion every single year. So over the 10-year period, even at the low end, that's a couple of $2 trillion. We're overspending our budget, our income of the federal government, by about close to $2 trillion a year. Have we reached that point where we can afford small steps, or do we need to go in and go after government, sort of the way you saw Javier Milei claim to do, and I think he did do it in Argentina, and take a chainsaw to it? Because we're at the point where we're so deep in debt, I don't think we can afford the little stuff anymore, can we?
Yeah, Lars. Here's how I think about it. I think a small step is better than no step. But the way I think about transparency and government spending is transparency cuts through government like water cuts through stone. That when it finds a crack, it can wipe away mighty walls of opposition. If you've ever seen the effects of water after a flood, that's what we need with government spending. And we have all of these examples of waste and inefficiency, and we need to keep that flow of water going, but we do need to see these big changes. And that's what, when I testified before Congress recently on the DOGE subcommittee, we talked about the cost of the federal real estate portfolio and the $4.6 billion we spend on furniture. And that's a crack in that wall. That's a small amount of savings. But what I encourage the members to do is do an agency overhaul bill. They have the authority and power to reimagine and reapply our founders' wisdom to today's challenges. And that's, again, I don't think it's draconian at all to dramatically downsize the number of agencies. And the founders wanted a small federal government for a reason, because they believed in making individual freedom bigger, and that there's a relationship between the size of government and the capacity for free people to pursue happiness on their terms. And that's what I think taxpayers understand intuitively. They experience it in their life. And so I think Congress needs to be much more aggressive and bold about these challenges.
Well, if they're not, I think we're going to be in very deep trouble. I don't think people realize just how close to real functional bankruptcy that we are right now. That's John Hart from openthebooks.com. He is the CEO of that group.